The air in the large lecture hall felt thin and sterile, recycling the same cool breeze over and over again. It was the kind of room that swallowed sound, making even the shifting of feet against the carpet seem loud. For David, sitting in the third row from the front, this room was more than just a place to learn. It was a battlefield he had spent months preparing for. He sat with his back straight, his eyes fixed on the whiteboard where complex equations were scrawled in blue marker. He knew that every movement he made was being watched, not just by the other students, but by the man standing at the front of the room. Professor Harrow was a man who carried his authority like a heavy coat. He was older, with gray hair that was always neatly combed, and a wardrobe that consisted entirely of pressed shirts and dark ties. He had been teaching advanced mathematics at the university for nearly 4 decades, and in that time, he had developed a very specific idea of what a gifted student looked like. David, a young black man who had come to the university on a scholarship, did not fit that mold. From the very first day of the semester, David had felt the weight of Harrow's gaze. It wasn't the kind of look that offered guidance or support. It was a look of scrutiny. When David raised his hand to answer a question, Harrow's eyes would narrow slightly, as if calculating the probability that the answer could actually be correct. When David got an answer right, the professor would simply nod and move on, never offering the praise he so freely gave to others. It was a quiet, exhausting performance that David had to put on every single day. He knew he had to work twice as hard to get half the respect, a lesson life had taught him long before he ever stepped foot in a college classroom. That particular Tuesday started like any other day. The hum of the overhead lights filled the silence as students settled into their seats, pulling out laptops and notebooks. David opened his own notebook, the pages already filled with neat, precise handwriting from the previous night's study session. He had spent hours in the library the night before, going over theorems and proofs until the words blurred together. He wanted to be prepared. He needed to be perfect. Professor Harrow began the lecture, his voice a dry monotone that seemed to drift over the students' heads. He turned to the board, writing out a complex problem involving probability and variable sets. The chalk clicked rhythmically against the surface. "This," Harrow said, turning back to face the class, his hands clasped behind his back, "is a standard distribution problem. However, the solution requires a nuanced understanding of the underlying variables. Who would like to attempt an answer?" The room fell silent. Most students avoided eye contact, hoping to remain invisible. David, however, looked straight ahead. He had solved the problem in his head the moment Harrow finished writing. He hesitated for a moment, knowing that speaking up always carried a risk, but he also knew that staying silent would be interpreted as ignorance. He raised his hand. Harrow's gaze shifted immediately. "Mr. Carter," he said, the name sounding flat on his tongue, "let's hear your estimation." David cleared his throat. "The answer is 4.2 recurring. But to get there, you have to account for the outlier variable in the third set. If you treat it as linear, the data collapses." A ripple of whispers went through the students behind him. Harrow didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply stared at David for a long, uncomfortable moment. The silence stretched, becoming heavy and thick in the cool air of the room. "An interesting approach," Harrow finally said, though his tone suggested he found it anything but interesting. "While your arithmetic is, for once, correct, your application of the theory is rudimentary. It lacks elegance." David felt a flush creep up his neck. It was a familiar feeling, the hot mix of frustration and shame that came from being dismissed despite being right. He had learned to swallow it down. He nodded, lowering his eyes to his notebook. "Yes, sir," he murmured. The lecture continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. For the rest of the hour, David felt a knot tightening in his stomach. He watched as Harrow interacted with other students, laughing with a boy in the front row, encouraging a girl in the back. The contrast was stark and painful. It wasn't just that Harrow didn't like him. It was that Harrow seemed to resent his very presence in the room. When the class ended, the noise level rose as students packed their bags. The sound of zippers and chatter filled the air. David slid his notebook into his backpack slowly, waiting for the rush of people to clear out. He needed a moment to compose himself before heading to his next class. "Mr. Carter," a voice called out, cutting through the noise. David looked up. Professor Harrow was standing at his podium gathering his own papers. He wasn't looking at David, but his voice was directed right at him. "A word, please, in my office, now." The command was simple, but it sent a jolt of anxiety through David's chest. He glanced around. A few other students were lingering, and they exchanged glances. Being called to Harrow's office was never a good thing. It was usually reserved for students who were failing or those who had broken the rules. David's grades were near the top of the class. "Okay," David said, his voice steady despite the thumping of his heart. "I'll be there." He walked out of the lecture hall and into the corridor. The hallway was long and bright, lined with glass display cases showcasing old academic journals. The floor was a shiny tile that reflected the overhead lights. There were no heavy doors here, just open walkways and the soft buzz of student life. As David made his way toward the faculty wing, he tried to figure out what this could be about. He hadn't missed an assignment, he hadn't been late, he had answered the question correctly. Maybe it's about the scholarship asterisk, he thought. Maybe there's a problem with my funding. The thought made his pace quicken. The scholarship was his lifeline. Without it, he would have to go back home, back to the neighborhood he had fought so hard to leave. The pressure was a constant weight on his shoulders, a heavy invisible backpack he could never take off. He reached the faculty offices. The door to Harrow's suite was made of frosted glass, modern and sleek. He pushed it open. Inside, the air was even cooler, almost cold. The reception area was empty, so David walked toward the inner office. Harrow was already sitting behind his large desk, a cup of steaming coffee beside him. He didn't look up when David entered. He was shuffling through a stack of papers, his movements slow and deliberate. David stood in front of the desk, his hands clasped in front of him to hide the fact that they were shaking slightly. "You wanted to see me, Professor?" David asked. Harrow finished his stacking and finally looked up. His eyes were sharp, dissecting David over the rim of his glasses. He leaned back in his leather chair, the material creaking softly. "David," Harrow started, his voice low, "I've been reviewing your midterm results." "Yes, sir," David said. "I got a 98. "Indeed, you did," Harrow said. He picked up the test paper from the top of the stack. He didn't hand it to David. Instead, he tapped it against the desk. "It is a very high score, the highest in the class, actually." David felt a small spark of pride, but it was quickly extinguished by the look on Harrow's face. The professor didn't look pleased. He looked suspicious. "The thing is," Harrow continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "I have been teaching this course for a very long time. I know the capabilities of the students who pass through these doors. I know the patterns of success." He stood up and walked around the desk, leaning against the edge so he was towering over David. "And frankly, your performance does not align with the standard profile of a student from your background." The words hung in the air. They were polite, spoken in an academic tone, but the meaning behind them was brutal. David felt the blood rush to his ears. He knew what Harrow was implying. He was saying that someone like David, a black kid from a poor neighborhood, shouldn't be capable of this level of work. "I study hard, sir," David said, keeping his voice even. "I love this subject." Harrow smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Everyone says they study hard, David, but hard work doesn't always bridge the gap. I find it curious. I have been watching you. You rarely ask questions. You seem to grasp concepts that take others weeks to understand. It leads me to wonder if your success is truly your own." David swallowed hard. The accusation was clear. Harrow thought he was cheating. Harrow thought he was a fraud. "I assure you, sir," David said, his voice firming up, "I do my own work. I've never cheated in my life." "We shall see," Harrow said. He turned back to his desk and picked up a single sheet of paper. It looked different from the standard exam sheets. It was thicker, almost like cardstock. "Tomorrow," Harrow said, handing the paper to David, "you will come to my office at 4:00 p.m. I have prepared a special assessment for you. It covers material we have not yet discussed in class. It is a problem I designed myself. It is rigorous." David took the paper, his fingers trembling slightly. "A special assessment? Why?" "Think of it as a verification," Harrow said, his eyes cold. "If you are as talented as your grades suggest, you will have no trouble solving it. But if you have been relying on outside assistance, you will find it quite impossible. If you fail to solve it, or if I detect any dishonesty, I will have no choice but to report you to the Academic Review Board." Your scholarship would be at risk. David stared at the paper in his hands. It was blank except for a few lines of instructions at the top. It felt like a death sentence. It felt like a trap. He looked up at the professor, seeing the disdain in the older man's face. This wasn't about education. This was about proving a point. This was about power. "I'll be here," David said, his voice barely a whisper. "Good," Harrow said, turning away to look out his window. "You may go." David walked out of the office, the glass door swinging shut silently behind him. He stood in the hallway, the white paper clutched tightly in his hand. The future he had worked so hard for suddenly felt like it was balancing on a razor's edge. He looked down at the paper again. It was time to get to work. David walked out of the faculty building and into the bright afternoon sun. The light was harsh, reflecting off the smooth concrete paths and the glass windows of the buildings around him. It was a beautiful day, the kind of day where the sky was a deep, endless blue, but David didn't notice any of it. His world had narrowed down to the single sheet of paper he held in his hand. It felt heavier than it should, like he was carrying a stone. He found a bench near the edge of the campus green and sat down. His legs felt shaky, a mix of adrenaline and fear fading into a dull ache. He looked at the paper again. At the top, in Professor Harrow's sharp, jagged handwriting, were the instructions. It didn't look like a normal test. There were no multiple-choice questions, no clear steps to follow. It was just a single, sprawling equation that seemed to twist back on itself, defying the standard logic David had spent years studying. He pulled a pen from his pocket. He needed to start. He needed to prove that he belonged here, but as he looked at the problem, a cold knot formed in his stomach. The variables weren't standard. Harrow had used symbols David recognized, but arranged them in a way that created a loop. Every time David tried to isolate a variable, the equation would collapse into nonsense. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, casting long, stretching shadows over the grass. Students walked by, laughing, talking on their phones, enjoying the freedom of the afternoon. David sat frozen on the bench, his notebook open, page after page filling with scribbles, crossouts, and frustrated calculations. Nothing worked. It was like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces didn't fit together. By the time the sky began to turn a soft orange, David's hand was cramping. He stared at the paper, his eyes burning. He wasn't just confused, he was scared. This wasn't a test of his knowledge, it felt like a test of his existence. He knew that if he walked into that office tomorrow without an answer, he wouldn't just fail a test. He would be confirming every suspicion Harrow had about him. He would be the fraud Harrow already thought he was. He packed his bag and headed toward the library. He needed more resources. He needed to find the one book, the one theory that would unlock this. The library was a large, modern building with automatic glass doors that slid open with a soft hiss as he approached. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of old paper and carpet cleaner. It was quieter here, a deep, respectful silence that usually helped David think. He found his usual spot in the back corner, a small desk hidden behind tall shelves of engineering textbooks. He dumped his bag on the floor and spread his notes out. He worked through the night. He pulled book after book from the shelves, flipping through indexes, looking for anything that resembled the twisted logic on Harrow's paper. He found similar problems, equations that dealt with fluid dynamics and probability, but nothing that matched the specific trap Harrow had set. Around him, the library emptied out as the night grew late. The overhead lights hummed, a constant, low buzz that drilled into his skull. David rubbed his temples, trying to push away the headache that was pounding behind his eyes. He looked at his watch. It was past midnight. He pulled out his phone and saw a text message from his mother. "How was class? Don't stay up too late. Proud of you." The simple words hit him hard. A lump formed in his throat. He thought about the sacrifices she made, the extra shifts she took at the hospital so he could focus on school. She believed in him so completely. She saw a son who was brilliant and capable. She didn't see the professor who looked at him and saw a criminal. He put the phone away, face down. He couldn't tell her what was happening. He couldn't tell her that his entire future was resting on a single, impossible problem designed to break him. He had to fix this himself. He turned back to the equation. He decided to stop trying to force the standard rules he had learned. If Harrow wanted to play dirty, David had to find a different path. He looked at the loop in the equation again. In standard math, a loop like this meant the system was unstable. It meant the bridge would collapse or the circuit would overload. It was a failure state, but David stared at it. Why would a professor give him a problem that was designed to fail? Was it a trick? Was the answer simply, this problem has no solution? No, that was too easy. Harrow would fail him for that. Harrow wanted a fight. David stood up and paced the narrow aisle between the shelves. He walked to the window and looked out. The campus was dark, lit only by the tall street lamps that lined the walkways. He saw his own reflection in the glass, a tired young man with dark circles under his eyes. He looked beaten. "Think," he whispered to himself. "Think, David." He went back to the desk. He picked up the problem again. This time he ignored the numbers. He tried to read the problem like a sentence. He tried to see the intent behind it. Harrow was arrogant. He believed he was the smartest man in the room. He believed he could create a maze with no exit. David started to write again. He didn't use the standard formulas. He went back to the basics, to the fundamental theories that most students forgot after their first year. He started subtracting the noise, peeling back the layers of the equation like an onion. Slowly, as the clock on the wall ticked past 2 in the morning, something began to shift. He found a small opening. It wasn't a solution, not yet, but it was a crack in the wall. He realized that the variables Harrow had used weren't random. They were borrowed from a specific, obscure theory, a theory that had been disproven 20 years ago but was still taught in history of math classes. Harrow was testing him, yes. But he was also mocking him. He was using outdated, broken logic to see if David would notice. David felt a spark of anger flare up in his chest. It wasn't just about passing the test anymore. It was about showing Harrow that he saw the game. He saw the broken pieces hiding behind the fancy symbols. He worked faster now, his pen scratching loudly against the paper. He didn't try to solve the problem. He tried to correct it. He treated the equation not as a question to be answered, but as a statement that was lying to him. By the time the sky outside the window began to turn a pale gray, signaling the start of a new day, David had filled 5 pages of his notebook. His fingers were stained with ink, and his back ached from hunching over the desk. But in the middle of the 5th page, he had written a single line of text. It was a revision of Harrow's equation. It wasn't the answer Harrow wanted, but it was the truth. David sat back and looked at his work. He was exhausted, his body screaming for sleep, but his mind was clearer than it had been in hours. He gathered his papers, straightening the stack against the table. He packed his bag. He walked out of the library, pushing through the glass doors into the cool morning air. The campus was waking up. Maintenance crews were sweeping the paths, and a few early runners were jogging past. It was a new day. The test wasn't until the afternoon. He had a few hours to sleep, to shower, and to prepare himself for the confrontation. But as he walked back to his dorm, he knew that the hardest part wasn't the math. The hardest part would be walking back into that office, looking Professor Harrow in the eye, and telling him that he was wrong. It would require a kind of courage that no textbook could teach. David tightened his grip on his bag strap. He was ready. He had to be. David woke up to the sound of his alarm buzzing sharply on the nightstand. He hadn't meant to fall asleep, but the exhaustion from the night in the library had finally caught up with him. For a second he lay there, staring at the ceiling of his dorm room, feeling a heavy weight in his chest. Then the memory of the day ahead rushed back to him. The test, Professor Harrow, the threat to his scholarship. He sat up quickly, his heart already beating a little faster. He showered and dressed, choosing a button-down shirt and neat slacks. It was his version of armor. He knew that how he looked mattered, especially today. He checked his reflection in the mirror. His eyes were still a little red from lack of sleep, but his jaw was set. He grabbed his backpack, making sure the notebook with his solution was safely inside, and headed out. The walk to the faculty building felt longer than usual. The campus was alive with the midday energy of students heading to lunch or the cafeteria, but David felt like he was moving through a different world. The air was crisp, and the sun was high, casting sharp, distinct shadows on the pavement. He focused on his breathing, trying to keep his nerves steady. He remembered his mother's voice, telling him to keep his head up no matter what. That memory gave him a small bit of strength. He reached the faculty building and walked through the automated glass doors. The lobby was quiet, the air conditioning humming softly. He took the stairs, needing the movement to burn off the anxious energy buzzing under his skin. When he reached the second floor, he paused for a moment in the hallway. He looked at the sleek, frosted glass door of Professor Harrow's office. It was closed. David checked his watch. It was exactly 3:55 p.m. He was 5 minutes early. He didn't want to give Harrow any reason to think he was stalling or afraid. He took a deep breath, pushed his shoulders back, and knocked on the glass. "Come in," Harrow's voice called out from inside. David pushed the door open. The office was exactly as he remembered it, cold, tidy, and intimidating. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, perfectly arranged by color and size. The large desk sat in the middle of the room, a barrier between the professor and anyone who dared to enter. Professor Harrow was sitting behind the desk, reviewing a stack of papers. He didn't look up immediately. He let David stand there for a moment, a power play that David recognized instantly. The silence stretched, filled only by the ticking of a clock on the wall. "You're early," Harrow said finally, lifting his gaze. His eyes were cool and assessing. "Eager to get this over with?" "Yes, sir," David said, his voice steady. "I have the solution." Harrow raised an eyebrow. A faint, skeptical smile touched his lips. He leaned back in his leather chair, folding his hands over his stomach. "Is that so?" That was fast. "Most graduate students take weeks to even understand the premise of that problem." He gestured to the chair in front of the desk. "Sit. Let's see what you have." David sat down, placing his notebook on the desk. He didn't open it yet. He looked at Harrow, trying to gauge the man's mood. The professor looked confident, bordering on arrogant. He clearly didn't expect David to have succeeded. He expected a confession or a failure. "Before I show you," David started, his heart hammering against his ribs, "I want to say that I didn't use any outside help. I did this in the library last night." "So you claim," Harrow said dismissively. "The process is what matters, Mr. Carter." "Let's see your work." David opened the notebook and slid it across the polished surface of the desk. The pages were filled with his handwriting, calculations, diagrams, and crossed-out lines where he had made mistakes and corrected them. It was messy, raw proof of his struggle. Harrow reached out and pulled the notebook closer. He adjusted his glasses and began to read. The room was incredibly silent. David watched Harrow's face, looking for any sign of a reaction. At first, the professor's expression was bored, perhaps expecting to see nonsense. But as his eyes moved down the page, his frown deepened. David had spent the entire night breaking the problem down. He realized early on that Harrow had given him a problem that was essentially broken. It was a paradox. If you tried to solve for the variables using standard methods, the numbers would spiral into infinity. It was unsolvable. At first, David had panicked, thinking he was missing something obvious. But then he realized the truth. Harrow hadn't made a mistake. He had designed it that way to trap a student who didn't know the history of the theory. The variables Harrow had used were based on an old model of thermodynamics that had been disproven decades ago. It was a model that looked correct on the surface, but failed under scrutiny. A student who relied solely on memorized formulas would try to solve it and fail. A student who truly understood the physics would recognize the flaw. David's solution wasn't a number. It was a rewrite. He had taken Harrow's equation, circled the specific variable that was outdated, and provided the mathematical proof of why it didn't work. Then, using a more modern theorem, one they hadn't even covered in class yet, he had corrected the equation and solved it. He hadn't just answered the question, he had fixed the question. Harrow turned the page. He read David's notes at the bottom of the page. The silence in the room grew heavier. The ticking of the clock seemed to get louder. Harrow's face went from frowning to something unreadable. His jaw tightened. He stopped reading and stared at one specific line where David had written, "The premise collapses here due to variable instability. Correction applied." Harrow didn't speak for a long time. He just stared at the paper. David felt the tension in his shoulders tighten to the point of pain. He wanted to ask if it was right, but he knew he had to wait. Harrow started, then stopped. He cleared his throat. "You identified the paradox." "Yes, sir," David said. "The variable set you used creates a divide by zero error if you follow standard rules. It creates a loop." "I am aware of what it creates," Harrow snapped, a flash of irritation in his eyes. He looked up at David, his gaze sharp. "I designed it that way." I wanted to see if you would spot the error or simply churn out incorrect numbers like a calculator." "I spotted it," David said simply. Harrow looked back at the notebook. His finger tapped the desk rhythmically. "But you didn't just identify the error. You applied the van der Waal correction to stabilize the system. Where did you learn this?" "We haven't covered this theorem." "I read ahead," David admitted. "I saw the variables you used, and they looked similar to a case study in the advanced text on the reserve shelf." "I cross-referenced it." Harrow stared at him. The arrogance was slipping. He looked genuinely surprised. He had expected David to cheat or to fail. He hadn't expected David to outthink him. The air in the room seemed to shift. The power dynamic that Harrow had carefully constructed was wobbling. "You read ahead," Harrow repeated slowly. "In the advanced text." "Yes, sir." Harrow closed the notebook gently. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked tired suddenly. The harsh lines of his face seemed to soften just a fraction. He looked at David, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time all semester. It wasn't a look of friendship or even apology. It was a look of recognition. "This solution," Harrow said, his voice quieter now, losing its sharp edge, "it is unorthodox. But it is mathematically sound." David let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. "Does that mean I passed?" Harrow didn't answer immediately. He stood up and walked to the window, turning his back to David. He looked out at the campus below, his hands clasped behind his back. "When I was a student," Harrow said, his voice sounding older, "I had a professor who did the same thing to me. He gave me an impossible problem. He wanted to see if I would break." David stayed silent, watching the professor's back. "I solved it," Harrow continued, "and I vowed that I would maintain that standard of excellence, I suppose. In doing so, I may have lost sight of the fact that excellence doesn't always look the same." He turned back around to face David. He picked up the notebook and held it out. "You solved it, Mr. Carter," Harrow said, "and you did so with a level of insight that I did not expect. You saw the trap and you dismantled it." David reached out and took the notebook. He felt a wave of relief wash over him, so strong it made his knees weak. He stood up, clutching the notebook to his chest. "Thank you, sir," David said. "There is no need to report you to the board," Harrow added, sitting back down at his desk and picking up his pen, signaling the end of the meeting. "Your scholarship is safe." David nodded. He turned to leave, his hand reaching for the door handle, but before he pushed it open, he paused. He looked back at the professor. "Professor?" David asked. Harrow looked up, his eyebrows raised. "Yes, the problem," David said. "It was a good challenge. Thank you for pushing me." It was a polite thing to say, a bridge offered to the man who had just tried to ruin him. Harrow looked at David for a long moment. He blinked slowly, and for a split second, David thought he saw a flicker of shame in the older man's eyes. "You're welcome, David," Harrow said softly. "Keep up the good work." David walked out of the office. He walked down the hallway and pushed through the glass doors into the bright afternoon sun. The world looked different now. The colors were brighter, the air smelled sweeter. He had walked into that office as a suspect, accused of being a fraud. He walked out as a scholar who had proven his worth. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the fresh air. He pulled out his phone to text his mother. He typed the words, "I think I'm going to be okay." As he hit send, he realized that the weight he had been carrying for months wasn't gone, but he felt strong enough to carry it now. He hadn't just passed a test. He had survived an attack on his character and come out the other side. And for the first time, he knew without a doubt that he belonged. The days following the meeting in Professor Harrow's office felt strange, like the quiet after a storm. David walked around campus with a lighter step, the crushing weight of the accusation lifted from his shoulders. But there was still a lingering sense of unease. He had proven himself in a closed room, in front of a man who wanted him to fail. But nothing had changed in the world outside that office. To the university, he was still just a student on scholarship, a number in a system. He went to his classes, he studied in the library, and he tried to return to his routine. Yet something felt different. He wasn't afraid of the whispers anymore. He wasn't afraid of the looks. He had looked at the impossible and rewrote it. That confidence settled in his bones, a quiet fire that kept him warm. Thursday morning arrived, 2 days after the test. It was time for Professor Harrow's lecture again. David walked into the lecture hall with his usual cup of coffee, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The room was filling up, the noise level rising as students chatted about their weekends and complained about their workload. When David took his seat in the third row, he noticed a shift in the atmosphere. A few students near him stopped talking. One boy, a junior named Kevin who sat in the front row, turned around and gave David a nod. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. Recognition. David pulled out his notebook. He didn't know if Harrow had told anyone about what happened. He didn't know if the professor had announced his victory or kept it quiet. He prepared himself for the usual cold shoulder, the usual scrutiny. The minutes ticked by. The large clock on the wall moved its hands forward. 10:00 a.m. The class was supposed to start. The side door near the front of the hall opened, and Professor Harrow walked in. He wasn't carrying his usual stack of papers or the textbook. He carried only a single piece of chalk. He walked to the front of the room and placed his briefcase on the floor. He turned to face the class, his hands clasped behind his back. The room fell silent instantly. The students sensed something was off. Harrow usually started writing on the board immediately, launching into equations without preamble. Today, he just stood there, scanning the rows of faces. His gaze paused on David for a fraction of a second, then moved on. "Open your textbooks to page 204, Harrow said. His voice was steady, but it lacked the usual sharp, cutting edge. There was a rustle of paper as students flipped pages. David opened his book. Page 204. It was the chapter on theoretical paradoxes. It was the chapter Harrow had pulled the impossible test from. "Read the first paragraph," Harrow commanded. A student in the back stood up and read aloud. The words filled the hall, dry and academic. It described a theoretical model for probability that was considered standard in many textbooks. It was the model David had been tested on. When the student finished reading, Harrow nodded. "Thank you, you may sit." Harrow walked to the whiteboard. He uncapped the marker. "For 40 years, Harrow began, his voice low but clear, universities have taught this model. We have taught that the variables stabilize at a certain point. We have taught that if you follow the formula, the numbers will balance." He wrote the equation on the board. It was long, complex, and intimidating. It was the same equation he had given David on that yellow sheet of paper. "However," Harrow said, underlining a section of the equation with the marker, "this model has a flaw that was identified recently." David sat up straighter. His heart began to beat a little faster. He knew where this was going. "If you treat this variable as a constant," Harrow continued, tapping the board, "the equation works on paper. But in reality, in the physical world, it creates instability. It creates a paradox. Most students accept the textbook answer because the book is authoritative. They trust the print more than they trust their own analysis." Harrow turned around to face the class. He looked older today, David thought. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper. "I have been teaching this flaw for years," Harrow admitted, his voice ringing through the silent hall. "I use it as a filter. I use it to test who is simply memorizing and who is actually thinking. I have given this problem to graduate students. I have given it to colleagues, and the result is almost always the same. They try to solve it the way they were taught. They try to force the square peg into the round hole." He paused. The silence in the room was absolute. Every student was leaning forward, captivated. "2 days ago," Harrow said, his voice dropping to a more personal tone, "I gave this problem to an undergraduate student. I gave it to him under difficult circumstances. I expected him to struggle. I expected him to fail. I expected him to confirm a bias I held." David gripped his pen tighter. He felt the eyes of the students around him turning toward him. The boy next to him glanced over. "I was wrong," Harrow said. The words hung in the air. It was a simple sentence, 3 words, but coming from a man like Harrow, they carried the weight of a mountain. "This student didn't just solve the problem," Harrow said, looking directly at David now. "He did something far more difficult. He recognized that the question itself was flawed. He didn't just fix the math, he corrected the premise." Harrow turned back to the board. He erased a section of the equation with a swift motion of his hand. Then in neat, precise letters, he wrote the correction. He wrote the exact theorem David had found in the library that night. "This," Harrow said, circling the new equation, "is the correct model." It was derived not by a professor, and not by a textbook author, but by a student in this room who refused to accept the easy answer. Harrow turned back to the class. He pointed a finger toward the third row. "Mr. Carter," Harrow said, "would you please stand up?" David felt his face heat up. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. He preferred the shadows, the back corners of the library, but he knew he couldn't hide. He stood up slowly, placing his hands by his sides. "The class should know," Harrow said, his voice lacking any sarcasm or malice. "Mr. Carter has demonstrated a level of comprehension that exceeds the standard curriculum. He has shown that he is not here to simply repeat what he is told. He is here to think." David looked at Harrow. He searched for a trace of the arrogance, the disdain. It was gone. In its place was a look of professional respect. It was the look one scholar gives another. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," Harrow said. "You may sit." David sat down. His heart was hammering, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from a strange, overwhelming sense of validation. The whispers started immediately, but they weren't malicious. They were impressed. The kid in front of him turned around, his eyes wide. "Dude," the kid whispered. "You rewrote the board equation?" David just nodded, a small smile touching his lips. For the rest of the lecture, Harrow taught differently. He didn't just dictate. He asked questions. He challenged the students to find flaws in his own logic. He treated the class not as subordinates, but as peers. And every time he looked at David, it was with a new understanding. David realized then that he had done more than just save his scholarship. He had cracked the armor of a man who thought he knew everything. He had forced a change. It wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was a quiet shift in perspective. When the class ended, the students filed out. David took his time packing his bag. He wanted to let the crowd clear out. He needed a moment to process what had just happened. The public acknowledgement, the correction on the board, it was more than he had ever expected. "David," a voice called out. He looked up. Professor Harrow was standing by the podium, waiting for the last few students to leave. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Harrow asked. It wasn't a command this time, it was a request. David walked down the steps to the front of the room. He stopped a few feet away from the professor. The distance between them felt smaller now. "You handled yourself well today," Harrow said. He looked down at his hands, which were fidgeting with a piece of chalk. "I wanted to apologize, not just for the test, but for my attitude this semester." David was stunned. An apology was even rarer than public praise. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. "That means a lot." "I have a lot to learn, it seems," Harrow said with a dry chuckle. "I have become comfortable in my methods. I forgot that brilliance can come from anywhere. It doesn't always look the way we expect it to." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. It was thick, filled with forms and brochures. "There is a summer fellowship program at the Institute for Advanced Study," Harrow said, holding out the folder. "It is highly competitive. They accept only 5 students from the region. I usually nominate my graduate assistants, but I think you are ready for it." David took the folder. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. The institute was legendary. It was where the greatest minds in the country gathered. "You think I can get in?" David asked, looking up. "I don't think you can get in," Harrow said, a genuine warmth entering his voice for the first time. "I think you will excel. I have already written your recommendation. I told them that you are the kind of student who doesn't just find answers, you find better questions." David clutched the folder to his chest. It felt like he was holding his future in his hands. "Thank you, Professor," David said. "I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Harrow replied. He picked up his briefcase and headed toward the door. He paused at the exit and looked back. "See you next week, David." David stood alone in the empty lecture hall. The hum of the air conditioning seemed louder now. He looked at the board, at the equation that had started as a trap and ended as a bridge. He had walked into the class a suspect, and he was walking out a fellow scholar. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be.